Welcome to the Events Podcast, where we talk each week with event professionals about how they plan, promote, and run their events. Whether you're running small meetups or large conferences, exhibitions, and concerts, we focus on finding actionable tips that you can use straight away. The podcast is sponsored by our ticketing system, EventsFrame. We developed this system after running 300 plus events a year, and we had an endless search for an amazing and a cost-effective ticketing and attendee management system. We've tried everything, and we designed EventsFrame to be super easy to use with the best discount options out there. You can embed tickets in your site or use our simple website builder. Most ticketing systems either don't publish their pricing or they charge a percentage of ticket fees, usually around 3%. But we just have a flat, low fee with no ticket fees and no restrictions. We've got hundreds of live events right now running events on EventsFrame, so please check it out. We've got integration with Stripe, PayPal, Braintree, bank transfer, and I know you're going to like it if you give it a try. Head on over to eventsframe.com for a free, no-risk trial. Now on to the interview. Today we spoke to Robb. He's the author of a book called Mass Participation Sports Events. He's a really sought-after international speaker, and he's the founder of the Mass Participation Asia Conference. He's got a fascinating backstory. He grew up in Zimbabwe in the middle of the civil war. He moved to South Africa, then Australia, then Singapore, then Bali. He worked on the Sydney Olympics and the Tour de France. He founded the Singapore Marathon and then sold it to Ironman, and then went on to form the Mass Participation Asia Conference. We get into a lot of things, including what are the business models for these kind of events, the huge rise of Tough Mudder events, and how these huge companies like Ironman are buying up several companies. So it was a fascinating interview. I could have talked to Chris for hours, but it was really good, and I'd like to turn over now and chat to Chris. Hello, and welcome to the Events Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Robb. He's the author of the book, Mass Participation Sports Events. He's a highly sought-after speaker. He runs a lot of events. He's lived all over the world. He's started a company which he sold to Ironman. So really interesting for someone who's run events in a lot of countries and especially for me and large sporting events. So a huge thanks and welcome, Chris.
Hi, Dan. Good to speak. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward and excited to talk.
Yeah, it's fascinating looking at your LinkedIn profile and your websites and stuff. You've just done so much. It's tough to sort of know where to start, But do you want to start just with a bit of your background and where you grew up and how you kind of went on to run your first events?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Look, I've been incredibly lucky. I think I'm one of those people whose job's been his passion. Nearly 35 years now in what we call the mass participation industry. So I grew up on a farm in Zimbabwe, pretty poor, to be honest. Part of that was in the midst of an independence war. As a 14, 15-year-old, I used to sleep with a gun next to my bed. Wow. My dad would kind of walk from our front gate to the bitumen road to check that landmines hadn't been laid overnight and various other things that happen in a war, which were amazing, gave me an incredible foundation in terms of, the value of community and comradeship and, resilience and many other things, which are really relevant to, I think, the sports industry generally and certainly the mass participation industry. They're so often about communities. I had the opportunity to organize my first event at the age of 16. So I was a 800, 1500 meter runner, and back in those days, we used to run on the old-fashioned cinder tracks, and the cinders had basically washed off our track, and we were literally pounding our legs on, I guess, concrete hard mud clay. So really? I decided I'd organize a little fun run and, got a few hundred people out and just got a real buzz from, making an impact in the community, the entrepreneurial side of it, the operational side of it.
Did you charge money for this event? Was this the free
event?
Yeah,
we charged money. No, we raised, in those days, a fair amount of money, several $100s from memory. It's many years ago now, enough essentially, the headmaster was in shock when we walked into his office with this massive bag of money that we'd collected. And I think they'd kind of thought, well, what do we do now? And so for a couple of months, we were rolling cinders into the track and, mission accomplished in many ways. And, I guess little did I know that was going to lay a foundation for, what's turned into a nearly 35-year career in the mass participation industry that's taken me all over the world, allowed me to literally impact the lives of millions of people and had many incredible experiences.
Wow. So what was next? What did you do? Did you leave Zimbabwe after the independence war, or where did you stay there?
Yeah, so I finished school there. I sat in my A-level geography class listening to the results of the election that brought Mugabe to power,
right.
and then went on to university in South Africa, where I was able to immerse myself even further into the industry. So I was, as I said, still an 800, 1500 meter runner, but quite quickly became the president of the Uni Running Club, and we had a portfolio of events. So I had this amazing opportunity to be part of this, I guess, kind of incubator, learning how to put on events while studying. By the time I was in my third year at uni, I was running a little business on the side out of my spare room, sort of running a branch office for an event promotion company. From there, went off and did a bunch of travel once I finished university, and ultimately, nearly 30 odd years ago now, immigrated to Australia.
Right.
Arrived in Australia with $15,000 in my pocket, and within,
you still haven't lost the accent amazingly as well. You still
sound I got this kind of mix. People ask me, am I Aussie, am I Kiwi, am I Zimbabwean, South African? So it's there's still elements of all of it there. Wonderful to arrive in Australia, young and full of enthusiasm, and set up my own event management company, and had some incredible experiences building events in Australia. And I think, still one of my career highlights was being the road event supervisor at the Sydney Olympics.
Sorry to interrupt. What did you do? So you set up this company. How did you start? What kind of things were you doing when you say you were kind of an event management company? What does that actually mean in reality? How are you making money? In
South Africa, I'd been involved in a concept, a corporate relay, basically. So teams of 4 or 5 people running 5 kilometers each in a relay with a whole bunch of hospitality and party and stuff around it. And the concept was huge. I mean, we worked on one event in Durban, which had 10,000 participants in it, and a number of other big ones. And I thought, wow, this concept's not being done in Australia. Let me give it a crack here. So I went along to South African Airways, who obviously knew of the concept in South Africa. Got them on board as my first sponsor, delivered the first event, which was really on a shoestring with a few hundred teams. And then went and pitched it to Deloitte and ended up turning it into a national series. So we had Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Canberra, and a couple of thousand teams participating in this event. And that kind of laid a foundation to do another number of other different events. We had a lunchtime legends. So that was around be a legend in your lunch hour, and people playing corporate sports. So we had about, I think it was 2,000 people every week that would play six-a-side soccer, rugby, volleyball, touch football in the various parks. We had 7 different locations going around Sydney. And slowly this little business grew to the stage where I was, approached to be the road event supervisor at the Olympics. And I was, working 2 jobs, literally working probably 18-hour days. I'd go to my office first thing in the morning, spend a couple of hours there, get a taxi into the Olympics, work there all day long, go home, grab some takeaway, go to the gym, go and sit in my office for a few more hours and go and grab 5 or 6 hours sleep and start all over again the next day. But, I was so driven by the fact that I was living my dream, living my passion, and the industry has, as I said, delivered many incredible highs. Some of those things are what I call money can't buy experiences. So, sitting on the lead vehicle of the Olympic marathon, going through the streets of Sydney with hundreds of thousands of people cheering the runners on is something I'll never forget.
Yeah,
it's been many of those.
It's interesting. I think when I talk to a lot of people on this podcast, and just my own experience as an entrepreneur as well, most people, they work crazy hours when they're starting a business. And I think some people nowadays, they don't want to do it. They've read the 4-Hour Workweek. I mean, I love that book. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a great book.
But
the reality is, I don't know anyone who's built any business of size who hasn't, put in kind of grueling hours in the beginning. I'm sure there's people who haven't, but I haven't met them. That's the reality.
Yeah, no, me neither.
Yeah. Now, just is a good time to you mentioned about getting sponsors and running these corporate events. It's probably a good time to what are these mass participation sporting events, corporate events? Is there a difference? And what's the business model? Because you talked about money from sponsors, money from attendees. How does that break down? And could you just give us an overview of what is this industry and what the kind of business model is, or is there several business models?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Dan. So I mean, the industry it's getting harder and harder to define what's mass participation. Going to a concert is mass participation. There's tens of thousands of people at political demonstrations, mass participation. But in the space that I've kind of operated in, I've kind of identified it as four main verticals. So big running events, cycling events, triathlon events, and more recently the new genres of obstacle races, your Tough Mudders, your Spartans.
Yeah,
and
my wife's really
things.
into those. Actually, I've done a couple. That's huge now in Europe, especially.
It's massive, and in Asia that whole industry is exploding. So as we were talking about before, I'm now based in Bali, but it's really exploding here. Yeah. Okay, but to get back to your question about then what's the business model? It's to be honest, it's a fairly challenging business model, and I think there's a lot of people within the industry that kind of almost live from hand to mouth. They have what I call passion projects. Many of them never really turn them into profitable, sustainable businesses. They're operated out of their spare room. It might be a husband and wife team. It might be a small organization. But the backbone of our industry is made up by lots and lots of small operators and a handful of big and medium-sized operators. Right. And the costs bases are increasing with increased compliance, venue availabilities, the whole security thing. The Boston bombing as an example, well publicized. And the challenges are finding enough revenue streams that are sustainable within an increasingly competitive market. So, sponsorship we spoke about, government grants, entry fee revenue from participants, merchandise, which is one which is fraught with danger. I myself have been burnt on a couple of occasions with merchandise, and I've seen many people, over order on stock, or, you have a rainy day and you get left with all that stock. Hospitality, training programs and the like. So, there's a handful of different revenue streams, and they vary a lot, So in Australia and most of your European and American markets, you generally attract a fairly significant entry fee, and your sponsorship becomes cream. In Asia, where the disposable income is starting to increase as we get an emerging middle class, but still relatively low, your entry fee revenue is very low in the main in most Asian countries. So you're absolutely dependent on significant sponsorship or significant government money, which makes the model even more, tenuous, because you can build an event for 10 years and your title sponsor decides they don't want to renew, or there's an economic downturn, and your event can become unviable overnight, as opposed to your more advanced markets where you can rely fairly significantly on entry fee revenue. And, say you lose 1,000 people in entry fee, it's not such a crippling blow that it can destroy your concept that you've worked 10 years to build.
Interesting. Yeah, I met a guy. You probably even know him. I forgot his name. He's an Italian guy. He runs the Prague Marathon, and he sounds like kind of what you say, how you described it. He's like an independent person. He runs the Prague Marathon. He's got kind of the exclusive deal. He's built it up over years. Pretty sure he gets paid something from the city of Prague, some kind of grant, because he promotes it. It's kind of a big tourist thing for the city. It's not a charity event, it's his business, and he does all what you say. He has a lot of sponsors, quite a high entry fee, so I think he's probably making most of his money on the entry fee. But yeah, it's interesting seeing that, because that kind of sounds like how you've described kind of a lot of people in the industry.
Yeah, and look, he's done fantastic stuff, and met him in fairly sure it's the same guy.
Yeah.
I met him at a conference in Malaysia a couple of years ago. Adidas is a big partner, and they've created that running hub around it. And
Run Check it's called. They've got a store, and they've got a whole operation. Yeah. They run loads of events, small events. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing, and a great case study to the industry, because one of the tricks that much of our industry misses, I believe, is year-round engagement with their participants. So your typical model is, hey Dan, entries for the marathon have opened, please sign up. You get a couple of emails with maybe a training program and some discounts on your online store and whatever, and then you get your race day information, and you turn up and you might get a post-event email or some kind of communication with your results and a certificate, and then no one talks to you for 6 months until the same process starts all over again. And then see events going and spending a whole bunch of money in traditional, in inverted commas, and what's traditional these days, marketing channels to try and attract new participants when they're not even speaking to this mountain of participants that they're standing on top of.
Yeah, definitely. It's all the whole all about using your having good things to offer to your email list, and even using your kind of list of contacts effectively, giving them good information, giving them new events is something I think in every industry people miss that. I think people are getting much better on it though.
Yeah, no, for sure, and it's increasingly challenging because email is becoming less and less used. So it's engaging, whether that be your social media channels or things in Asia, for example. In many countries, WhatsApp is massive, and people starting to communicate more through WhatsApp, and sharing content through that, and Messenger, and there's so many different platforms. The fact that it can be so fragmented makes it quite challenging.
Interesting. So that's fascinating. So how does it work with the charity aspect? Because a lot of these events are charity, and I guess I'm wondering, is it the same business model and they agree to give a percentage to charity, or is there again a big variation on how those events work?
Yeah, there's a huge variation of how they work. You get your extremes, like for example your London Marathon, which is massively oversubscribed, and people pay a premium to get a slot if they miss out on the ballot, and their premium and their commitment is that they raise money for charity. In other markets, charities put on their own events, so they take the commercial risk on the P&L and often end up getting burnt on it because they don't have the right resources to be able to deliver it and understand all the nuances of it. And then you get situations where it'll be a commercial operator like myself who might decide that there's a charity benefit or charity beneficiary to the event, and in my time in Australia, that would be the kind of trade-off would be that the charity would provide you with X number of volunteers and you would give them X amount of contribution, whether that was an agreed flat fee or whether it was a percentage of entry fee revenue or a flat fee per participant. Right. So there's lots of different models. Interestingly, in Asia, the whole charity model is very much in its infancy and I guess less popular. So we had an example, the Singapore Marathon. So my company for a number of years organized the Singapore Marathon, which at its peak was 60,000 participants. Wow. And it had an element of it, an Ekiden relay, which was 6 people in a team running a marathon distance in relays. And there were 300 teams and they would sell out in a matter of hours. So with Standard Chartered, who's the title sponsor, we decided one year that we'd use that as our charity platform. So teams had to pay an entry fee, which I think was $300 from memory, and they had to make a commitment that between their 6 runners, they would raise $500 for a charity of their choice. So on a giving platform, they would choose their charity and raise $500. We got massive backlash on social media, people saying, how dare you force us to raise money for charity, albeit that we'd given them the option to raise for their own charity. And that year, we only sold 230 of the 300 teams. So again, it's, the lesson in that is across the industry and across the globe is that you need to be very conscious of what local precedents are and local culture and nuances. So often I see in our industry people from other parts of the world arrive in Asia with a concept that's been successful in America or somewhere in Europe, and they just think because it's been successful there that it's going to work in Asia. And many people fall on their faces because they don't take into account and really understand the local nuances. It's
interesting. And the charity thing as well, just generally the way the world's going, there's much more kind of transparency demanded of things like that. And, you hear about, I mean, not necessarily sporting events, but I've heard about people running, just charity balls and things like that. And quite a small percentage was given to charity. And now people are having to really disclose, like, when you say this is a charity event, what does that mean? Does it mean 30% of the ticket price is going to charity? And people are normally cool with it as long as it's like they don't feel like they've been duped somewhere,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So really interesting detail. We'll get back to your story in a sec, but I'm curious about, you mentioned the Spartan Races. I heard a podcast interview with a guy, I think it was Joe DeSena, who started the Spartan Race series, which is just like a juggernaut. There's a few of these now. There's there's the Gladiator Races and all these other ones. Where did people see this coming, or did this just come from nowhere, this whole obstacle race thing? And
it's evolved rapidly, as have some of those other genres, the what we call mob races generally, so events that people participate in teams rather than individuals. So your color runs, your electric runs, those kind of things. And a number of them have been faddish, for want of a better word. So Color Run has grown hugely and it's declining in a number of markets. Electric Run, similar. And, there end up being lots of kind of copycats of them. And Spartan and Tough Mudder, the 2 main players in that space. in some markets they continue to grow significantly, in other markets they're starting to plateau, and in some cases decline a little bit, as I understand it. So I think, the consumer of today is constantly looking for something that's new, something that's different, want to have a different experience. And, these have certainly taken the market by storm. And to answer your question, did people see them coming? I don't think to the degree that they've grown, people saw them coming, and they've really opened the eyes to people of the possibility. But yeah, certainly, the growth of Spartan is an incredible story.
It's funny, like, I do CrossFit here in Prague, and it's funny that, like, pre-CrossFit, people would spend a fortune kitting out gyms to make them like spas, and it turns out people want to work out in a prison, like that's like it's like, and I enjoy those races because I've done a marathon and I've done a few half marathons. I'm not a runner. It's just a kind of one of those good experience to do. You train for it and you do it. And I love the kind of the Spartan races and that whole, the obstacle stuff and the camaraderie. It's good. But yeah, I'm curious. I mean, obviously everything reaches a peak. It can't keep growing forever. And I'm sure, like you say, it's going to decline or is declining in some places.
Yeah, and I think that the great thing that Spartan have done is exactly what I was speaking about maybe 10 minutes back, is their engagement, their ongoing engagement, their opportunity, the opportunity that their loyal followers have to kind of step up in intensity and distances and those kind of things. They've built a great portfolio, as in many ways have Ironman. So you've got the big thing is the dream of going to Kona and participating in a world championship at the full distance, but you've got the 70.3 and the 5150s, and they even have the Iron Kids version. So built an ecosystem that people can aspire to and progress through, which I think is crucial. And that becomes harder for the more fatty type of thing. So is it a 5K or is it a 10K color run type of thing? It's there's not too much of a progression opportunity there. It's a daytime or a nighttime maybe. Those are some of the tweaks that seem to get made to it. But Spartan and Ironman have been able to build a brand that brings people in at different levels, entry level, progressing all the way through to the big challenges. Definitely.
Well, that's a good time to jump back to your story, because I know you have some history of Ironman. So you mentioned about started your business in Australia and were a road manager for the Sydney Olympics marathon. Like, what did you do next?
Yeah, so after the Olympics, I was very fortunate that JP Morgan came along and ended up being one of my biggest clients in Australia with an event called the JP Morgan Corporate Challenge, which was part of a global series that at that stage I think had been going 23, 24 years when they came to Australia. And essentially a corporate running event, a team event, in as much as you would turn up with any number of participants beyond 4. You could have some companies had 200-300 of their staff participating, and it was kind of a unique concept, and still is, where everybody ran, and then afterwards you made up your teams of either men, women, or mixed teams based on how well people had done, and tried to kind of out-strategize the other companies in terms of who they were putting in their team, and hugely popular. They decided that they wanted to expand into Asia, so they asked me to help them with a feasibility study, and we looked at Shanghai and Hong Kong, and ultimately they chose to go to Singapore. And at that stage, the events industry was the mass participation events industry was very much in its infancy, and ultimately went through a process and weren't particularly comfortable with the RFPs that they'd had, and they asked me to consider setting up an office in Singapore to deliver their events. So, one wonderful opportunity to have a global brand like JP Morgan as an anchor client. I can't claim in any way that it was strategic. It was totally opportunistic, and ended up being in Singapore for 15 years. I lived there for 10 years, and the first 5 years I had my Australian office and my Singapore office, and I was commuting between the two of them. And then I landed a big 7-figure sponsorship to start a new cycling concept called Cycle Singapore, which I then grew into a brand called Cycle Asia. And when I landed that, I moved to Singapore to manage the launch of that event, which grew to 11,500 cyclists in Singapore and events around the region.
It's interesting. Like, I go to Asia a lot. I mean, several times a year, and I've never been to Singapore, which is the weirdest thing ever. I mean, I've been to Hong Kong, 50 times maybe. It's like I've been to Bangkok all the time. Taiwan, I'm off to Taiwan again in December. I'm going again this year. And I don't know how it works. I've always planned to go to Singapore, then something happens, and Singapore and Hong Kong are the two main business hubs of Asia. And I really want to visit, but it's going to happen next year. And I run events. I mean, I run multiple events a year in Singapore. It's kind of a weird history I've got with Singapore where I've never been there, but I do want to go.
It's worth going. It's a wonderful city. I mean, very easy to get around, very efficient, very clean, great place to do business, very supportive government. People refer to Singapore as Asia-like. I guess that's what
I've heard. I mean,
Asia in an armchair. It's it's very functional. It's it's a great place.
Which
to
is,
do
I mean,
business,
Hong Kong's like that, but it's got a bit more of an edge still. Hong Kong.
I
think. I haven't even been to Singapore, but just what I base it on. It's It's okay, cool. So what was next on that?
So then started that business in Singapore, and it was an incredibly challenging baptisms. We did, I think, 8-9 months worth of planning for this event. We targeted to have about 3,000 participants. We ended up getting over 7,000 people register, and 8 days before the event, the Nickel Highway, which is one of Singapore's main arterial roads, collapsed as a result of some tunneling that was happening for a new underground railway line, and tragically 4 people lost their lives. And we literally sat around for nearly 7 days, not knowing whether we were going to have an event or not. We got the green light to go ahead at midnight, standing on a street corner the night before, we were due to have the event. Event flagged off. It was crazy, all hands on deck to do the final bit of setup. Standing on the Padang, which is this beautiful cricket or field in the heart of Singapore, looking at the city skyline, watching the prize presentations happening, thinking, wow, this is just amazing. When I got a tap on my shoulder to look around and see the medical director standing next to me, who'd come to tell me that someone had died of a heart attack. Tragic in so many ways, just a real kind of baptism of fire. Welcome to Asia with your first event. We sat in the debrief, and the lady from New York who'd been running the series since inception, started the debrief by saying, congratulations, you guys have hit every speed bump in year one that most people take 20 years to hit, and you've successfully overcome them. So it was, massively challenges, but so many incredible learnings, different things about, when someone dies in Asia, it's very different to what happens in Western cultures, and, learning to work with, in partnership in what was a national crisis. Our little challenge of making sure that our running event happened was completely insignificant compared to dealing with people dying in a tunnel collapse. So recognizing that we have to sit on the sidelines and wait our turn, and understand the challenges that the government was facing and everything that went around that. So the real value of partnership and patience and contingency planning and crisis management were all learnt, and great lessons from it.
That's a good time, I guess, to talk a bit about the logistics of running an event, because that's what I run small events, and so obviously, touch wood, there's nothing's really happened, but there's always a possibility of some crisis, disaster, terrorism, someone having a heart attack, even all these terrible things. But I mean, that percentage chance is magnified exponentially when you have several thousand people doing an event. So it must be a stress running one of these events, thinking please, you must breathe a sigh of relief when it's over and nothing happened.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. It's the part of the event that I absolutely love. So I thrive in, being in the command center on event day, running, those kind of challenges. So, Singapore Marathon as an example, 60,000 participants, 5,000 volunteers and staff, shutting down a major city, impacting hotels and even the airport to some degree, and all sorts of other infrastructure, and challenges coming left, right, and centre. And the briefing that I always give, we do months of training and simulations, tabletop exercises in terms of what can go wrong. And the final briefing that I always give to the key staff is, something will go wrong. It's how we as a group respond to it that will ultimately determine our success. If we go into an event as complex as this, expecting that everything is going to go according to plan, we're going to fall flat on our faces. We don't go in looking negatively, expecting something to go wrong or wanting something to go wrong in a negative sense, but we have to be wide open, eyes wide open, to know that there will be a challenge of some sort. You know, one year we had a 40% volunteer no-show because of rain and storms and the like. And, you know, we were redeploying staff. You know, you imagine, and the analogy that I often use when I'm talking to corporates around this, and I do more and more public speaking in this space, is, you know, imagine if you increased your staff headcount by 5,000 people in the space of about 4 months, and every one of them reported for pretty much the first time within the space of a few hours on one day. You know, and you're providing their feed, and they're not in an office, but they're scattered across the streets of a city, and you're deploying them with buses, and you're picking them up, and you're communicating with them, and all those kind of things. You know, so many valuable lessons that are relevant to pretty much any industry and size of organization, whether you're a team of 10 or a team of 5,000, the same principles apply in terms of, you know, clear structure, roles and responsibilities, escalation, protocols and procedures and hierarchy and so on.
It's true. And what I found with things that go wrong is like you develop I'm really into SOP, standard operating procedures, but something goes wrong, you make an SOP for it. So like, I mean, in the kind of conferences and things I run, you know, there's a lot of things that happen, like there's no Wi-Fi, the catering doesn't come, speakers don't turn up, the venue's locked when you get there. Like, and each of these things, there's a solution, ridiculous, like impossible as it sounds, there's a solution for all these things, you know?
Absolutely.
And it's just a case of, you know, it's always a lot hard. It's the hardest the first time, and then you kind of, you know, get into it, and you know, and things that would. It's funny because I got a friend who runs a couple of conferences a year, and we talk about the things that stress him out, and I don't even think, because I run 300 a year, they don't even register them. I'm like, that happens all the time, every week of my life that happens. And you run enough events, it just doesn't bother you after a while. And I guess the terrorism thing is the big thing that you mentioned is bigger now, and that must be a big part of, especially events in cities that, you know, involve public areas and stuff.
Yeah, certainly it is. And you know, it's very much about, I believe, about collaboration. So, you know, working with city authorities and understanding, you know, your current threat levels and risk analysis and the like. Yeah, it's you know, it certainly is worrying, but you have to put your plans in place. You have to have your contingencies and your crisis management, and be very sure on how you communicate and work in partnership with identifying possible threats.
Sure. Great. So Singapore, what was next on your globetrotting career adventure?
Yeah, so, you know, then a couple of years ago, 2015, I published my book, Mass Participation Sports Events, which was wonderful, and launched that in Singapore. In 2016, I sold that business and gave me the opportunity to move to Bali, which is wonderful. I based myself here with my
So I'd love to jump into that, the whole sale thing. I had a really interesting interview with a guy called Steve Monington a couple of weeks ago, and he runs a business broker for events, and he typically works with trade shows and larger events. But it's interesting to see how did you sell your event, and is this something that happens a lot in the mass participation area?
Look, it's going through a period of consolidation. So, you know, there was a period where Ironman was buying a lot of businesses up. You know, they bought Wanda out of China bought Ironman, and then bought Rock and Roll Marathon out of the US, and you know, the Cape August cycle event in South Africa, to name a few. And you know, they decided that this is a
Chinese group. You said this is a Chinese group that bought all these
Chinese
companies.
Group, yeah,
right.
Yeah, massive Chinese organization, one of the biggest property developers in China. I own most cinemas around the world, which is probably unbeknownst to many people, but one of the biggest cinema operators, and various other verticals. You know, they were looking for a base in Singapore. The Singapore Marathon as the kind of jewel in the crown appealed to them. I had a team of about 30 staff and some assets and IP that was of interest to them. So the negotiations happened and sold the business to Ironman, which, as I say, gave me the opportunity. And I was very, very fixed on my idea that I'd like to exit. I'd been in the industry a long time, and I've heard, you know, many stories of people that kind of get locked in for a couple of years, and, you know, seldom hear happy stories around that, because you've been an entrepreneur, having a degree of your own independence for many years, and now you're reporting to a head office overseas and so on. And
yes,
I was fortunate enough to be able to negotiate a deal where I, you know, pretty much, you know, handed over the keys. I had a couple of months of having to provide information and so on, but, you know, I didn't have to keep going into the office with a new boss every day and doing all that sort of thing, which I'm incredibly grateful for.
That's interesting. Steve Mornington, the guy, you should check out the interview, actually. It was really, really interesting guy. He's brokered a lot of big event deals. And he said typically there's an earn-out period, like you said. At the very least, people would want you to stick around for the first year if it's an annual event, the first year of the event, and probably sometimes even 2 years. So it's interesting how you got out so quick. Is that typical, you think, or just they just had their own way? You already had a brand name, they knew how to run marathons. That was it.
No, I think it was pretty unusual, but I had a stable and experienced team with some senior management in it. They brought in a very experienced guy from Australia to run the region, who's a fantastic guy and a great practitioner in the industry. So all those things were able to align. Great.
Obviously, gave you, I imagine, some financial cushion as well. So actually, I want to jump back to one thing. Ironman's a really interesting thing for me, because it's one of those things where you kind of presume Ironman is like a public name or something, like it's like a it's a double triathlon, I guess, or twice the length of a triathlon, I think, isn't it? But I didn't realize for a long time it was a private company. You always just sort of presume an Ironman is like a word you use to describe a type of event.
Yeah, no, look, it is absolutely. It started in Hawaii, and now obviously a global business with different models, many events owned by them, many events licensed and franchised by them around the world. Private company owned by this now owned by this massive Chinese company.
No, and who was it started by one person, or who was behind it originally?
It was started by a group of guys sitting in a bar one night saying, what would be the ultimate event, the ultimate endurance test event. So it's it's 180 kilometer bike ride. It's let me get my facts right here. Massive swim and a full marathon.
Yeah,
you go through all that and then end up running a marathon at the end of it.
That's unbelievable. So I know people with Ironman tattoos and stuff. I mean, it's like
that's right.
Cool,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So what was next then after the sale? That's really interesting how you did that, and that must have been a career highlight, I guess, to actually build a company up and sell it to someone like Ironman.
It was wonderful, and after all those years, I was ready for a change of pace and a change of not complete direction, but just nice to be able to do something at a different end of the spectrum now, where I'm operating fundamentally on my own. So I've got three main verticals to my new business. So I'm based in Bali, which is wonderful, with my wife and little 4-year-old boy Sam. Wonderful lifestyle for him. And I do advising around the region. So I'm currently working on a project with ASICS, the shoe brand, on a concept that I actually created for them 4 or 5 years ago called ASICS Relay, which is basically an evolution of the concept that I started my business with out of Australia. So it's gone to a nighttime event with entertainment and so on. But this year it took place in 5 cities. So Bangkok, Jakarta, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Manila. So I've been in an advisory role. They engage event organizers around the region, and I help them just giving strategic advice and quality control and so on. And I've got a number of other, consulting clients. I just did a fantastic launch in Singapore last week for a new client of mine out of New Zealand, a company called Velohawk that's created this amazing premium bike storage box. And we ended up doing their launch in the Ferrari showroom in Singapore. The premium bike storage alongside a premium car. Wonderful opportunity. So I've got a number of these clients that I work with around the region, advising, consulting. I've then got a growing international speaking career. So I speak both within the industry and then I'm speaking increasingly to corporates on the lessons that I've learned in mass participation that are relevant to as I said earlier, any business. And then I've got a business called Mass Participation Asia. So I founded that in 2015 as an annual conference to bring the industry together to promote best practice, encourage people to work together within the industry. And that's now got a number of other verticals. So I've just launched about a week ago my first mass participation masterclass, which will be a year-long online program with me, mentoring and sharing my nearly 35 years of experience with a group of 15 to 20 people. In fact, I got my first webinar tomorrow to share the details of that with prospective students. And then the third edition of the conference is coming up in Singapore in December. So at this stage, we've announced over 40 speakers from around the world, probably end up with around about 55, probably 250 delegates. The only conference of its kind in the world that focuses on all the verticals of mass participation. with the main objective of bringing the industry together, promoting collaboration and driving best practice, and just loving the opportunity to share and give back to the industry and bring people together.
Great. I'm kind of, yeah, the website's massparticipationasia.com, by the way, for that. I'm just checking out the website. Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by people running, I heard a great phrase like a micro multinational, which kind of like, it's a multinational company, but you're not Goldman Sachs or Pepsi Cola. You're in a specific niche. You're doing some consulting yourself. You're running some events, these community things. I'm curious how you structure things. Like, do you have a full-time team or contractors? Are they remote, or do you have an office in Bali? Like, what's the sort of actual structure for all these? Because you've got a lot of things going on. I imagine you've got a team. I'm curious, are they full-time or contractors? Or how do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, literally, I have one person based out of Singapore who delivers the conference. All the rest of the stuff, and that's what I'm loving. Whilst I had an amazing team when I sold my business to Ironman. I had 30 staff, and many of them still friends. But it's challenging running staff and running a business. And I'm loving the fact that I don't run staff anymore, and I don't have the challenges of every entrepreneur or most entrepreneurial businesses of cash flow and clients. And obviously I've got clients, but less so. I've got a fairly select small group of clients that I work for on, some of them I work 2 days a month, some of them I work 5 days a month. And, then my speaking takes me to different parts of the world. I was over in Austin, Texas in February. I delivered the closing keynote at Running USA, which is probably, the biggest conference of its kind in our industry with about 700 delegates. I was in Melbourne 2 weeks ago speaking at an Australian Payroll Association conference. I'm off on Sunday speaking at a conference in Bangkok, and then a couple of days later in Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and a couple of days after that in Shenzhen in China. And those are all kind of more industry related, sports related. But have just wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, just jump into that. It's fascinating. It's a bit of a tangent, but it's an interesting thing, the whole speaking at conferences. I presume now you're generally working as a paid speaker. I mean, do you sometimes speak for free if you think there's an opportunity there? Because it's interesting. I always tell people a lot of people can get too greedy in the beginning if they don't have a track record like you've got and just demand to be paid from day one. And I always say, if you don't have a name for yourself, you should just speak whatever you can, even if it's for free, Then when you can build up a name for yourself and you've got a good reference and great feedback, you start getting paid. I'm curious how you've approached it and how you approach it now.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm only probably 2 years into my speaking career, and I still speak for free on occasion. Yeah. Particularly if it's industry related. And the business model varies depending on who the client is. And sometimes it's a great publicity opportunity. Sometimes it's a networking opportunity. Sometimes it leads to an advising or consulting opportunity. Yeah. You're dead right, Dan. You do need to put the yards in like you do in any business, and build up your portfolio, build up your network, and it varies with sometimes I pay my own way even.
I do as well, definitely. Yeah.
No, the opportunity in Ho Chi Minh is an amazing one. I last year I was invited a think tank, a Swiss-based think tank called Races. The guy who founded that used to work for Davos and went away about 10 or 12 years ago, I think, and founded Races Global and brought it to Asia 3 years ago. And I was invited to speak in Calcutta. I sat on a panel which spoke about the future of tourism in Asia, and I gave a sports and mass participation perspective. And it occurred to me that sport wasn't on their agenda. So I approached the founder and said, sports are a growing currency in Asia, and if you had any interest in putting sport on the agenda next year, I'd be more than happy to help you. And he came back to me a couple of weeks later and asked me to help assemble and facilitate a sports panel at this year's conference, which is going to be in Ho Chi Minh. But every delegate and speaker there pays their own way. You pay your flights, you pay your accommodation, but it's this incredible. Last year there were 350 delegates from I think 67 countries. There were 7 or 8 government ministers there, and it was one of the most cerebral experiences I've had for years. The caliber of people, the caliber of conversation that was happening in the there were five panels running in parallel, and there were times when I wanted to be at every single one of them. So you don't earn a cent out of that. You pay for your flights and accommodation, but you have an incredible experience and make a great network.
Definitely. I mean, it's one of my biggest pet peeves is like speakers who become instant prima donnas. And I have to say in advance, this is a real minority. Most people I work with are super cool and amazing. But I've worked with a few people who we've given a lot of people their first, we work with a lot of teachers, we do education related stuff. And a lot of people, we've given them their first ever keynote or their first ever session. And they've never done anything. And then I'll contact them again next year and say, hey, great, we can pay your expenses this year. Or, and your flight and hotel, and they'll be like, my rate is this. Like, not even like, this is my rate. And I'm like, thinking you're so stupid because, you might have got that once for one conference, but for you then to speak to everyone, even the people who've helped you get going and say, this is my rate. And this one guy in particular I'm thinking of, I don't think he's spoken anything since, because he got a certain amount of money for one event. And then he had this very arrogant opinion that was what everyone was going to pay him, And I'm thinking, everything's about opportunity, You can go to an event and make one connection, and that connection can lead to 10 other things, And I've done everything. I've been paid to speak. I've spoken for free. I've done a barter arrangement where I've been able to exhibit my things at an event, and I've just done it to help out friends, Like they need someone to help them out. And the other thing I always tell anyone wanting to speak as a kind of tangent is just be super helpful to the organizer. You know what a hassle it is running an event. If you're the guy who says, let me help you with registration, let me do this, let me promote, show them you're going to promote it to your network. Like, honestly, you can boost your desirability as a speaker just by being cool and just helping out the organizer with everything. And it's amazing how many people miss that opportunity.
Yeah, look, you're so right. It's exactly the way that I focus on operating. Someone struggling to put out the tables, I'm more than happy, helping move chairs and tables and doing all that kind of stuff. And, I think that's probably, a lot of that's my nature anyway, but it's also that understanding of, being in the event business, been there, done that. I know what it's like when something goes wrong. And if I can help you to get over that and put on a great face for your delegates, why not?
Well, the chairs and tables, that's a perfect concrete example of what you said, because when we get people at our events who they come and they get there early and they start, because it's always a last minute rush, the registration desk's not ready, something's not ready, and just start helping. They don't just stand around vaguely say, oh, can I help with something? They just do it. And I do that myself. Any event I'm involved in, I just go and help with registration, because I always need help with registration or setting up the theatre or whatever. It's just, it's absolutely anyone who's thinking of doing it.
Sorry, and one of the other things there as well is the opportunity. You often will see speakers that will blow in half an hour before their presentation, do their presentation, hang around for 5-10 minutes and disappear and gone. Best opportunity, however experienced you are, you can learn from other speakers, even if it's not what to do. And hanging around in the room afterwards and making yourself available to the delegates is, how you often pick up your next job as well.
Definitely. And I would say as well, even more than that, like if you're a speaker, go to the networking party, because that is the place you're going to meet everyone. And it's the ideal networking situation, because you've just been on stage. Everyone knows you, you don't know them, but they know who you are because you've been on stage. And then that is, it astonishes me the amount of people who don't go to the networking party, which for me, like if you're speaking at an event, don't book a flight out the same day, always stick around until afterwards and maximize, the value from it.
Great advice. Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So that's obviously what you're doing now. It's been a real, I could just do another 5 interviews with you and zoom into all these different things you've done. It's all fascinating to me. What, anything you want to plug, and anything you want to talk about in terms of things you're doing or where people can find you online?
My website is chrisrobb.asia. Facebook is chrisrobbasia.
Yeah, we'll put links in the show notes anyway to all this stuff. So
that'd be great. Thank you. And yeah, look, I think anybody who's interested, Mass Participation Asia in Singapore, 10th to 11th of December at the Singapore Hilton, immediately after the Singapore Marathon. So 2 reasons to come into Singapore, which is a great city. We've got amazing speakers from all over the world, from lots of different elements of the industry, and that one's massparticipationasia.com. Anyone's looking for a speaker with a unique and interesting story would love that opportunity. And anyone, you've obviously got a lot of people that are in the event industry. I'm so excited about my mass participation masterclass, which I think I shared with you. It's a 12-month online program with monthly webinars, one-on-one mentoring with me, frameworks, case studies, a peer group that's going to hold you accountable to your goals for the year, and so excited about the opportunity to interact with, I guess, the next generation of leaders in the mass participation industry.
Great. Well, just one closing question, Chris, because I'm sure there's a few people listening to this thinking, I'm really into surfing. I'm into running. I'd love to do a large mass participation event. Now, here's the question. Is this market fished out, or is there still opportunity? Is there still a chance with the right location and the right niche to make a lot of money and run a cool event, or are the glory days over?
Look, I don't think the glory days are over. The reality is that there's not a lot of events in that space that make a lot of money. There's a few of them that end up being successful hits. I think that some of the many benefits come from the impact that you're making on society.
Yeah.
You know, some of the biggest buzzes I get is, and it still happens, I get stopped in the street and someone says, "Thank you, Chris, you changed my life. You know, as a result of you putting on Cycle Singapore, my boss persuaded me to borrow a mountain bike and ride the 20K, and I now ride 5 times a week, and I'm a much better person for it." Or, you know, I took up marathon running to participate in the Singapore Marathon or similar. You know, those are the buzzes. It's not the material stuff. Yeah, of course, it's nice. It's nice to have enough money to be comfortable with. But, you know, my $1 million things are the money can't buy experiences that I've had.
That's true.
You know, the wealthiest man in the world or woman in the world couldn't have bought the seat that I had on the back of the lead vehicle in the Olympic marathon, and being in team cars in the Tour de France, and, you know, all those kind of amazing experiences that have come out of the industry are sometimes, for me personally, more important than the dollars in the bank account.
Great. Well, that's a great way to finish. Thanks a lot, Chris, and all the best.
Thank you, Dan. Wonderful speaking. Thanks for the opportunity, and hope to hear you speak one day.
Hope so. Cheers, man.
Thanks, mate.
Do you want to sell more tickets to your amazing events? EventsFrame event ticketing has been built to minimize the amount of time it takes to buy a ticket. Result? You sell more tickets. Check out eventsframe.com.